Thanks very much. Really appreciate the chance to come here back to Uti and speak to you. So when Dr. Tarun asked me to put together something, he at first I think thought I would do something on the Palni Hills, right? An area that is very dear to me that I grew up in, and I've been able to do some interesting studies there. But then I thought, I'm living in Sri Lanka right now, and why not maybe share some of what's happening over there? Because there's so many similarities actually in what's happening in the Nilgiris and then what's happening in the Palnis. So I framed it around that. This is, I'm a teacher. I teach environmental science and geography. I get a chance to collaborate with scientists once in a while who go really deep into it. And I'm looking at usually broad landscapes. I'm interested in the mapping. And so my curiosity kind of drives things. I mean, that's what got me interested in like some of that satellite imagery and working with maps. But let me just tell you a little bit of this is going to sort of take us on a little journey here to look at the situation in Sri Lanka and both how it's similar and different. The highlands here, the Nilgiri sort of plateau is kind of similar to what's known as the central highlands in Sri Lanka. And they have many similar things in terms of their geology and the climate. They also have what seems like a grassland shola mosaic there. It's slightly different. But they also have a similar history, of course, of colonial planting of tea and coffee and those things there. And they've also had introduced vegetables. They also have carrots there, cabbages and all of that stuff, right? Strawberries, those things. And they're also equally vulnerable to climate change, right? That keeps coming up, that issue there. There's some slight differences with rainfall in Sri Lanka that make the ecosystems there and the kind of the forest structure and what you have different, right? So I'm going to be talking about that in a moment. Let's go to that. So yeah, I mean, one of the big things is sort of the rainfall regime there. And so Sri Lanka, if you think about it, has like these 4 different climate areas, climate zones. And it's the wet area that this dark blue over here that's where all the species endemism is. It's very high in that area. And then in the dry zone, it's very similar. The species are quite similar to what's in India. But the rainfall, I just put together a quick graph on like Norelia, which is the main hill station in the Central Highlands, and Uti. And I mean, it actually is very similar. It's almost identical, like annual rainfall. But what you'll see in Norelia is it actually gets more rain throughout the year. It's more evenly spread, so it's always wet. So there's this idea of the wet zone being this ever wet area. And if there's people who are studying this and who've gone back in time and looked at sort of the evolution of these species, it's been ever wet for a long time. And so you've got all kinds of interesting things there. Yeah, that's just a little bit. I put some more maps up there about sort of land use. I think one of the key things that Sri Lanka can be very proud of is how much land area in the country is protected. I got a figure of about 28% that is protected there. So one of I'm going to now sort of, I started in the highlands and I had like the Sky Islands there, but the example that I want to share with you is actually from the lowland rainforest of Sri Lanka. And the area that it would be similar to here in the Nilgiris would be more like Silent Valley. Although even in Sinharaja, remember that it's ever wet, so you're getting rain throughout the year. And there's a really interesting case study of what's happened there. So it was a lowland rainforest, and it had, over quite a large area, but in the 1960s and 70s, it was being logged. And that was a time when, issues like they didn't even have concepts of biodiversity at that point. And everything back then, I think the philosophy was we've just got to make money to add to our GDP. So they had brought Canadians to come in and help them sort of mechanically log that area. But so a lot of their native forest is actually just logged. And then some of it was also converted over to timber plantations. So it's lower down, so there weren't grasslands there. We've been talking a lot about grasslands today. In this context, it was all a forest ecology. So you had that issue. You also had the same thing that we've been talking about here about how some of these non-native species sort of jumped out and then invaded other areas, right? And as a result, also the people living in that area many people lost their livelihoods. People used to go into those forest areas to extract non-timber resources, those things. So that all, what happened is they eventually, the logging stopped, they protected it. There was a people's movement, again, kind of similar, somewhat similar to the Silent Valley movement here in India. And they protected that. But then the restoration sort of started, and it didn't start necessarily on purpose, in the sense that what they did is where it had been logged, they left that alone. So in what is now the core part of Sinharaja is a natural forest, and the forest has basically come back with basically no intervention. Like today, we've been talking about all these different kinds of interventions and things that you can do. In that case, it's quite interesting that the forest came back quite well on its own. But on the edges, the couple that you see here, Professor Nimal and Savitri Gunatilaka, did an interesting experiment, and they had been very involved in studies of the forest. So if you go into any of the literature, you will see their names. They're probably some of the most important people doing the studies, right? And several of you have collaborated with them here in the audience. So one of the things is they had a forest dynamics plot there. So there was a 1 hectare, what is it? Was it 5 hectare plot that had been studied to look at changes in that plot over time. They mapped every single species in it, went through like decades of research. But they also, on the side, they thought, why don't we try to do some restoration work? So they started working on restoration of pine forest. So we're talking about an altitude of about, say, 300 meters. Forest Department had planted pine as a boundary, right? So the pine was there basically to delineate the boundary of the Sinharaja protected area. But it was a kind of lifeless. There wasn't a whole lot of diversity there in that area. So what they decided to do is they got permission to try to restore these areas. So what you can see here is on the left is the pine forest that is in the middle of. They've started to restore it there, and what happened is what some of you were talking about earlier, that when you restore things, if you just cut the non-native trees down, all you do is get a bunch of weeds there, and that's exactly what happened here. So the Gunatilakas and the part of the team that they worked with came up with several strategies to better restore these pine forests, right? So this is Sinharaja. That's the picture on the right is my students with learning about this invasive fern in a plot that's done by a private hotel company, and they're restoring rainforests there. And they're basically using the lessons from the Gunatilaka study. So I mean, this kind of flow diagram looks. I've just sort of put some of the problems that were there, and going through what some of what their objectives were. So you can see that they had a problem with these pine plantations of fires, soil erosion, landslide problems, poor regeneration of native species, reduced groundwater recharge, lack of tangible benefits for local communities. You'll see similarities here, right, over here in the Western Ghats with that. And so what they wanted to do is they needed to do a study to find out what are the optimal conditions for the rainforest to come back. And they needed to evaluate like which species are best to bring in at what time, right? So they had these different sort of steps that they took in the process, right? So they did surveys of the area, and the reference was the forest dynamics plot in Sinharaja itself, and they did studies in nurseries, and this happened over. So we're talking about like I think almost a 3-decade study. It was 1991 that they started this out. And it started slowly, but it's come to fruition, and they've got a published study on it, and it's the kind of thing that other people can now replicate. That's the idea of it. Anyways, so they looked at a whole bunch of other things. They looked at the socioeconomic side, all of that. But what did they learn from it? One of the things that they learned is that when you cut back trees, one of the things you want to look at is the light conditions. So they had an experimental plot where they cut strips, like saying 3 meters or 6 meters or more than that. And they found sort of an optimal amount of cutting to do, right? One of the other key lessons was this idea of when you restore, using site-specific species. I've heard Several of you bring that up already, but not just randomly putting in trees that you think might be nice to grow in that area, right? And they also look to put in species that would have some socioeconomic benefit. That is, that people from neighboring villages could go into that area and extract those without disturbing it. This is from their article that came out in the book Ecological Restoration down here, and you can see sort of it's the Professor Gunatilaka's pictures over time of the site and showing it. So it really goes from this monoculture site up to the site where it's quite a mixed plantation. And I had the opportunity, I was taking my students there for field trips, and we were doing sort of, bird watching and sort of introductory sort of rainforest studies there. And I was going there over the last 20 years, and I saw these changes right there. And Professor Gunatilaka is a friend of mine, and I got to work with him on doing some of the maps. So I helped him with some of the maps for that. Tourism plays like a major role in it, and that's really seen as I don't know. That's in terms of a strategy. They really use tourism there to enhance sort of ecological restoration, ecological approaches to things. And the picture on the right is that secondary forest that's now recovered from that had once been logged. So in the 1970s, that would have been like stripped land. And the recovery in Sinharaja is amazing. So if you get a chance to visit Sri Lanka, it's something worth seeing. And I think even there, the story isn't as widely celebrated as it should be. These are sort of my takeaways. Tarun asked me, make sure you have some takeaways here. And so what are the lessons? What can the NBR, what can the Nilgiri Biosphere Reserve get from it? The first thing is really simple, and that is restoration works. When I was in the I don't know, like 20, 30 years ago, when I was going out with Bob and Tanya in Cody and in some of those areas, I mean, this idea of restoration was relatively new. And they were trying to restore grasslands, right? That's what they were experimenting with, right? So, Vasant came over there, and we were that was in the early days of it. But what we see in Sri Lanka is that clearly that efforts to restore these ecosystems does work. But as some of you mentioned before, it takes time. It's not something. It is. You're really talking about decades of investment, and for the forest department to you have to have long-term sort of commitment to that, all of us. Yeah, and then the issue about ecological succession is really important. The site specific that you need when you put in species, you can't put in a climax species in at the beginning of your process of ecological succession. You really need to think about what you're putting in, and that goes together with the site specific species. So you need to understand those ecosystems really well. But I'm preaching to the choir here. You guys all know that. Yeah, and then the local engagement in the process. I heard in the discussions today, like interest of people going out and being able to engage in this and like really get involved in restoration. I think all of us in this room would really be interested in that and taking students and getting people out there and getting involved in it. And then the last thing, just to repeat on that role of ecotourism has worked quite well in Sri Lanka. So even in Horton Plains, which is a high altitude montane grasslands and shola forest type place, they've got opportunities for people to go in and see that. So that's quite interesting. I think that's basically it in a nutshell for me. Thank you very much.